We've already been going through a lot of change in 2025, and a lot of that change has related to the cycles of Venus and Mars and very important aspects that Venus and Mars have been making with other planets. This week of April 20th to April 27th is a waning moon, leading to a very potent new moon in Taurus coming on April 27th. But this is a week that, as an astrologer, I've had my eye on for a very long time because these stories of Venus and Mars that have been so foundational to all the great change that we've personally and collectively been going through this year are both reaching critical turning points of their aspects with other planets. One of those storylines involves Venus in Pisces forming a conjunction with Saturn in Pisces, and Venus and Saturn at the same time forming a harmonious sextile aspect with Uranus. This week we'll have the third and final conjunction of Venus and Saturn. And at the same time, Venus is moving through her last sextile aspect with Uranus. And it is even more magnified because it is combined with the north node of the moon. The other big storyline involves Mars, and Mars forming its third and final opposition with Pluto in Aquarius at the end of this week on April 26th, a day before that new moon in Taurus. This opposition between Mars and Pluto takes us back to last November and towards the end of October when Mars first came into an opposition with Pluto. They did so again when Mars was retrograde at the beginning of 2025. And all the big changes we've gone through this year with Mars retrograde, Mars direct again, there's something that even though we've already had a lot of change, we've already gone through a lot of lessons relating to Mars this year, we've known that there's still a final piece left unresolved until we finally get through this last opposition with Mars and Pluto this week. And it's magnified all the more because the Sun in Taurus, at the same time, Mars and Pluto are opposing one another. The Sun in Taurus is in the middle of them, forming a square aspect to both of them, creating a fixed T-square configuration. Now, what does that mean? I will go into depth here about both of these two storylines and take you into an exploration of the deeper cyclical meaning of both. Hey, I'm Gray Crawford. I'm a professional astrologer and I love working with people one-on-one in consultations. My astrological services are focused on fostering greater self-realization and purpose and finding ways to help empower you to be more resilient with your life story and however things are playing out related to your astrology. I'm going to put a link to book a consultation with me down below in the comments below. I'd love to work with you if you're interested in looking at how to relate to all the big changes happening with the astrology that's going on right now. And like I said, there is so much change happening this week. And what I'm going to do is start off by going into the meaning of Venus and Saturn coming together in Pisces and how Venus and Saturn are also simultaneously coming together exactly with the north node of the moon, while they are still in close range to a sextile with Uranus in Taurus. Now, this Venus, Saturn, and Pisces combination with Uranus and Taurus is a storyline that goes back to the beginning of January in 2025 when Venus first came into Pisces. But it was in the middle of January that Venus got closer and closer to Saturn and Pisces. And in some ways, we can think about this story beginning when Venus formed her first conjunction with Saturn in Pisces on January 18th. Then about a week or so later, Venus came into forming a sextile aspect with Uranus and Taurus on January 26th. And so something related to this story began back then. And at that point, Venus was bright as an evening star, bright following sunset in the night sky. She then moved forward through Pisces into Aries. In the beginning of March, she stationed retrograde. She then went through this process of purging and purification and death and rebirth and regeneration. And towards the end of March, she moved back into Pisces, and now she was visible as a morning star, rising before the sun. And while retrograde, she formed another conjunction with Saturn on April 7th. And then she formed a sextile aspect with Uranus later on the same day, although for some people in your time zone, it would have been on April 8th. And so we are coming to the third and final chapter of this story right now. So, what does this mean? I'm going to talk to you a little bit more here about the meaning of Venus and Saturn. So, one thing about Venus and Saturn is to realize it can really have multivalent meanings and can really show up in different ways and different meanings for different people. This could relate to their birth chart. This could relate to just what's going on in their life with relationships. A lot of times when people hear about Venus and Saturn coming together, knowing that Saturn does tend to bring some challenges and obstacles and barriers and tests, people often do have a negative association in their mind. And it is true that one of the possible meanings of Venus and Saturn coming together can be difficulty in relationships, tests in relationships, suffering in relationships, dissatisfaction in relationships, or those same types of things, troubles and tests related to desires or creativity or something we want to create or something that we desire and something is just going really slow or facing some kind of obstacle or barrier. That is one way that it can show up, but it's also not the only way Venus and Saturn can show up. This Venus themed painting by Edward Burne Jones brings up another side of Venus and Saturn to me in Pisces because Venus is exalted in Pisces. And so we could have this exalted romantic yearning or desire for something that has some type of obstacle to the fulfillment. It could be this type of romantic melancholy of great yearning and imagination and fantasy that can also lead to creative and poetic revelry, or could be a feeling of desire for what we don't have, or feeling in some ways like we have this desire for something, but we're in some ways constrained or too contained or to facing limits of some sort of Saturnian obstacle. There is this sense of that cold, solitary nature of Saturn can combine with Venus to bring up feelings of solitude or alienation. But that is only one side of how they can show up. There's also another side of Venus being exalted and her fertile life force of creativity being brought into that cold and solitary and old ancient realm of Saturn and bringing new life there. Now, in one way or another, Venus retrograde periods like we just lived through, they often do bring tests and phases of dissatisfaction in all types of relationships. This can happen in a romantic relationship, but it can also happen in the workplace with work relationships. It can happen amongst family members, just people you collaborate with, relational patterns in general. It also could relate to certain tastes, certain creative directions and desires. We often, when Venus goes retrograde, pull back from what we've been relating to or what we've been desiring. We often question things. Sometimes we become critical of what's going on. We can often become very aware of what's not working for us. And so that movement of Venus retrograde back into contact with Saturn again on April 7th, in that general time period, there could have been certain dissatisfactions going on and looking at ways in which we feel constrained or have obstacles or things that just aren't working. But now that Venus has moved direct and now that Venus is moving back into contact again with Saturn right now this week, there could be this new sense of life force of Venus. Venus bright and getting brighter and starting to pick up some speed as a morning star is assertive, and she can be more aggressive. She can be more practical, can start going after more of what she wants. And so she can use that cold realism, practical, pragmatic focus and concern of Saturn to start laying down a foundation for these long-term dreams and goals and desires that could have emerged for you over the course of this Venus retrograde. You also might have realized in terms of your work or relationships or creativity, certain things that maybe weren't working, but in the end, you realized things that you really want to devote yourself towards, whether that's a relationship or a family or a job or a business or a certain project. And now that Venus is moving direct and you've become clear that this is something long term you are fully committed to and devoted to, this Venus Saturn alignment this week can really be solidifying that devotion, that dedication, and that commitment, and have you putting into effect new plans and formulations of how to make this work out in the long term, and taking what you've realized about what wasn't working during the Venus retrograde and making pragmatic, productive changes, altering things, modifying things, putting these new plans into effect and getting a vision of how to do that. There's another side that I also think about with Venus and Saturn coming together, and it's really fascinating to me just from an astrological perspective that Pope Francis just passed away as we're coming into this aspect, because Venus can go with religious figures. We have Venus exalted in Pisces, which has this exalted status like a pope, and Saturn, of course, going with death and old age. But there's something else about Pope Francis passing away as this aspect is coming together that I think is really important. And that's the fact that he took the name Francis for Saint Francis. And like Saint Francis, although I know there's things that people criticize about Pope Francis, one thing I just would like to highlight and emphasize that I value was his dedication and focus on helping people that are in poverty. And in contrast to other popes, he did a better job of making some reforms towards focusing more on people that are on the margins and on the outskirts, especially in terms of that focus on poverty. And so that is something that does go with Saturn. Saturn does go with people that are marginalized, people that are in poverty, people that are in need. And so we can feel this sense of this exalted Venus and love and care and devotion and creativity being brought into our communities and communities of need that need our protection in this time and need our support in this time of all these great systemic collapses that are going on. And this sense of systemic collapse that is going on is real, because this is not just Venus and Saturn coming together. It's Venus coming together with Saturn, who is coming to the end of the Saturn cycle with Neptune. And Venus has not just been moving back and forth across conjunctions with Saturn. Venus has also been moving back and forth across conjunctions with Neptune. Venus will get back to Neptune later. That's not happening this week. So this week, what's going on is Venus is drawing us into the meaning of Saturn as Saturn is coming to the end of its cycle with Neptune. Then she will be moving on and pulling us into this new sense of meaning that we have with Neptune and Aries. This Saturn-Neptune conjunction that is coming next year, but it will already be happening for all intents and purposes this summer in July, is so extremely powerful. It's happening at the beginning of Aries. The Saturn-Neptune cycle goes with all the immense changes that are happening right now, all the massive geopolitical changes happening, the great uncertainty that's going on all over the place related to economics and immigration and various other political issues. That's one side of it. But we also can just feel with all the technological change, how much is already changing and how that's going to be affecting the economy and the workplace. And collectively, these Saturn Neptune times, they do bend reality. And while they bring up a lot of uncertainty, they also bring up the potential to change your life and reshape your life, because as these systems fall apart, it does create the opportunity for new systems, new structures to come in. And so there's something unusually important about this Venus Saturn conjunction as a result. And then, of course, it's not just the fact that Venus and Saturn are coming together, it's that they are also forming this sextile aspect with Uranus in Taurus. And this can bring a extra spark of innovation and hope and inventiveness and looking for how to create change. And again, even when we think about in terms of how Saturn and Neptune can bring a sense of collective despair and disillusionment and delusion and darkness, but it also creates opportunities for change. The Uranus sextile can also spark a sense of hope and belief in our ability to bring light into the darkness and build and support the communities we care about. It once again makes me think about the passing of Pope Francis in relation to his namesake, Saint Francis, and the very famous prayer of Saint Francis that calls on the Lord to make us an instrument of his peace. And that where there is hatred, it calls to sow love. Where there is doubt, to bring faith. Where there is despair, to bring hope. Where there is darkness, to bring light. Where there is sadness, to bring joy. For it is in the giving that we receive. This has so much to do with Venus and that exalted Venus in Pisces being able to spur and spark hope in the darkness, even more so with this sextile with Uranus in Taurus. So to go a little bit more into the meaning of the sextile between Uranus and Taurus, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fundamental, foundational meaning of the sextile, which takes us back to the Thema Mundi, which is the chart for the birth of the universe or creation or God, you could even say. And when we look at this chart and we put all the planets in around it, it has Cancer rising with the moon in Cancer. It shows us all of the domicile rulerships of the planets. And it also reveals to us the nature of the aspects. And through this, we can see that the sextile aspect, it's considered to be a harmonious, beneficial aspect because it has the nature of Venus. We can see that in the Thema Mundi chart, Venus in Taurus is forming a sextile to the moon in Cancer. And we also see that Venus in Libra is forming a sextile aspect to the sun in Leo. And so both of the lights, the sun and the moon, have sextile aspects with Venus. And so we can bring this sense of creative collaboration and that harmonizing that comes in relationally between planets that are in a sextile aspect to this. And it's interesting that this particular sextile aspect is Venus in Pisces and Uranus in Taurus, which is a sign of Venus. And so while we are still dealing with the meaning of Uranus, which can be like a lightning strike of sudden change and revelation and insight and fast moving events, it's not a square from Uranus. And it's not a trine from Uranus, it's a sextile, which is a little bit more of a softer aspect. It's collaborative. And I like the sextile in terms of being able to bring in that lightning and sudden change and liberation of Uranus, but in ways that are hopefully easier to integrate and make use of and come up with creative solutions. So I really love the aspect this week of Uranus and Taurus having the sextile with Venus and Saturn as they're coming together, because no matter how much despair or difficulty you might be facing, this is going to bring in the promise and potential to find inventive, innovative solutions, to work with whatever limitations you're facing and use those limitations to spark creative solutions, creative ideas, and new movement. The other thing to keep in mind with all of this is the Venus cycle that we've been in and this retrograde phase that we've been in. And where Venus was within her solar phase as she has come into each of these aspects. So, again, if we go back to the beginning of January and mid January, when Venus first came into contact with Saturn and first came into contact with Uranus, she had just reached her maximum elongation where she was as high above the horizon as she gets. She was getting brighter and brighter in the sky and coming closer and closer to us. And so we, at that time, might have started facing some sort of sense of limitation or some sort of sense of honing from Saturn. Maybe starting to get more of a sense then, there is this way that Saturn is going to maybe reduce things or take away the things that are more inessential. Some sort of process combined with Uranus of letting go of excess and honing things down to what is more of the authentic, essential desire. But we were only at the beginning of understanding that. And then we went through this retrograde process during March where things started breaking down and regenerating and purifying. And so, again, that first conjunction with Saturn and Pisces really was very different than where we are now. And what's also interesting is Saturn was also about 11 degrees away from Neptune. So while they were already starting to come towards the end of their cycle, the Saturn Neptune also wasn't as intense then. Then Venus came into the first sextile with Uranus. This was really powerful because Uranus was really alive and activated and saturating the astrological environment due to stationing direct. And so this definitely could have brought up a bunch of creative ideas and long range plans. And then what happened after Venus had already gone through the retrograde conjunction with the Sun, had become visible again as a morning star, she then came into that second conjunction with Saturn in Pisces on April 7th, and then formed the exact sextile with Uranus later in the day. Although if you're in the Eastern time zone, like this is a chart for Washington, D.C., it would have been a little bit after midnight in the middle of the night on April 8th. And so that all brings us into now. And the difference now is that Venus is no longer retrograde. She is moving direct. She's picking up brightness again. She's starting to pick up speed again. She's in this much more empowered place with her solar phase. We've gotten a deeper sense of our desires and our relationships and what we want and what we want to create and what we build. And so she's coming into this final conjunction with Saturn in a very different place. And the other thing that's just really incredible is that the north node of the moon is there at the same time. And so that head of the dragon is just magnifying and amplifying the enormity of this combination coming together here. What's also really interesting is that on Sunday, April 20th, which is the day that Venus formed the exact sextile with Uranus, Mercury was moving through an exact sextile with Pluto at the same time. And Mercury also had been having a back and forth with Pluto over the course of the Mercury retrograde we went through. And so that those sextiles with Mercury and Pluto go back to the beginning of March. But because we're also dealing with this Mars Pluto this week, there's a really helpful mediation that Mercury is helping us here with between the Mars Pluto opposition. And so we are also getting a way to somehow get some innovative, inventive ideas, ways to move, ways to hopefully get out of some stuck places we've been feeling stagnated relating to whatever these Mars Pluto and Venus Saturn issues might be. Then on Monday, April 21st, we get the conjunction of Saturn with the north node of the moon as Venus simultaneously is coming into an exact conjunction with the north node of the moon. Now, in another year, I would be focusing a lot about this Saturn North Node conjunction because they don't happen all that often. We haven't had one since 2013, but there's been so much else going on that I know for myself, it's not been one that I've been personally focusing on a lot. But if you want to think back to what's happened in history or just happened in your personal life with those conjunctions. The last one we had was in September of 2013 in Scorpio. Before that, there was a Saturn North Node conjunction in Gemini in June of 2002. Before that, there was a Saturn North Node conjunction in Capricorn in 1991. Before that, there was a Saturn North Node conjunction in Virgo in July of 1979. And previous to that, there was a Saturn North Node conjunction in Aries in April 1968. And you may also be somebody that's born in one of these time periods, or you may have important people in your life that are born in one of these time periods. And so you may know a little bit about how this Saturn Neptune can show up in people's lives, if you know someone like that or you have it yourself. But that's different than, collectively living through the transit. And so there's something here where it does make me in the end think more about the higher potential of this, which to me is getting this long term vision of what you want to increase and build slowly over time, and thinking about how to build that elegant, beautiful Venus dream of desire that you've hopefully cultivated and come into deeper relationship with over the course of this retrograde phase. Now, the other side of this could also be with the North Node being involved. There can also be illusions of ambition. And so the combination of this with Mars and Pluto coming into the opposition at the same time while squaring the Sun, that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. It does all. This is another part of it that definitely makes it important to look at the underbelly of your goals and ambitions and aspirations, and just to make sure that you are really getting clear about what it is you truly desire and want and what your goals are, and getting more clear about what those are to really align it with your integrity and what you truly authentically desire and want. Then a couple of days later, on Wednesday, April 23rd, we're going to have the conjunction of Venus and the North Node. And so we then get Venus and the North Node coming together just before Venus and Saturn come together. And at this point, what's very interesting is that the moon is in Pisces and moving towards the North Node, as well as Ceres. So I do think it's interesting that Ceres is also in Pisces as part of all of this. Ceres is the Roman name of the goddess Demeter. And in the way that Demeter loses her daughter Persephone to the underworld, but then Persephone steps into her power in the underworld, becomes the queen of the underworld. Demeter goes through all of her grieving and cathartic loss and soul searching, ultimately is able to get her daughter back into a relationship. But as part of that whole process, she also brings the mystery initiations to humanity. So she is not only the goddess of grain and agriculture and bringing life and sustenance on a material level to humanity, she also brings the mystery initiations, which puts us into touch with these deeper elements of our eternal soul. And all together with the way she also is connected to natural cycles of growth and death, she puts us into touch with places of darkness and death and grieving and loss, but how it can still in the end, and will in the end, lead to rebirth and regeneration and new life. And so Ceres being also involved in this whole lineup that's happening here, and the moon coming across her in these days this week as the moon is waning, as Venus and the North Node are coming together, as Venus and Saturn are coming together. It's just really amplifying the potency of all of it. And then it'll be on the next day, on Thursday, April 24th, that Venus will form her exact conjunction with Saturn. At the same time, the moon is forming a conjunction with the North Node of the moon, and then we'll move into a conjunction with Saturn and Venus. And so there is this really powerful lunar tidal force, that Piscean head of the dragon just so amplified. And so I really feel there is incredible power here in terms, again, of getting in touch with whatever this authentic desire you've cultivated out of the retrograde, whatever you've realized you really want to dedicate yourself to, commit yourself to. Again, that could be particular relationships, businesses, work, creativity, just practices of love, spiritual practices, whatever it might be. There's something here to really dedicate yourself to and have as this long term goal, dedication, commitment. That's one of the sides that can come out of this. And hopefully, there's ways that you're feeling your way into whatever that is in the midst of all this incredible change that's happening. Because you can also see here that as they're all coming together, they're only about a little bit over 3 degrees away from Neptune. And so the Saturn Neptune conjunction is getting really close. The Venus Neptune conjunction is also getting really close. And so that is one of the big storylines happening this week. But there is another equally important for different reasons, and that is all about Mars. Now, it's also just interesting to think about the fact that both Venus and Mars are so lit up and important this week, and just how important Venus and Mars are for all of us. They are the planets that basically orbit on either side of the Earth. Venus is the closest planet to our planet Earth, orbiting within our orbit. Mars is the closest planet to us, orbiting outside of our orbit. And similarly, they have this meaning of Venus being about more of that inner life and inner desire and inner values and our aesthetics and creativity and what we want to magnetize and receive in our life and pleasures and passions. Mars also has to do with passions, but it's more of this inflamed desire of pursuit and penetrating things and going after things, but also protection being such a huge meaning of Mars and putting us in touch with what's so important to us that we will do whatever we can to protect it. But in both cases, they have to do with this sense of Mars being about going after things, creating things, protecting things, whereas Venus has that more internal desire. And so Mars also being activated this week and clashing with Pluto while also coming into this critical phase and configuration with the Sun is putting us in touch with our willpower and our assertion and our ambitions and whatever sense of empowerment we have, whatever kind of power struggles we've been in. So let's take a closer look at this Mars-Pluto configuration. So Mars and Pluto will form their exact opposition a couple days after the Venus and Saturn combination comes together, and that will happen on April 26th at the end of this week, just before the new moon in Taurus. Now, this goes back all the way to the beginning of November in 2024 when Mars in Cancer came into an opposition with Pluto in Capricorn. Mars then moved into Leo, and then Mars stationed retrograde in Leo on December 6th, moved back into a second opposition with Pluto on January 2nd, while retrograde then went back into Cancer on January 6th. And it was recently in the last week on April 17th that Mars finally came back into Leo to set off this final opposition. The opposition aspect, like I talked about earlier, using the thema mundi, and we look at how the sextile aspect has a quality of Venus, we can deepen into our sense of the opposition aspect by also consulting the thema mundi and seeing how it is a nature of Saturn, because Saturn forms oppositions with the two lights, the sun and the moon. Saturn in Aquarius is opposite the sun in Leo. Saturn in Capricorn is opposite the moon in Cancer. And similar to Saturn, an opposition can feel like a barrier, like an obstacle, like this great tension and test of wills and two things just facing off in the way that Saturn is slow and can feel entrenched in this impenetrable opposition and two things just facing off. Because we're talking about Mars in Leo and Pluto in Aquarius facing off, we are really thinking a lot here then about this issue of power and power struggles and two things going up against each other. And they're going up against each other in fixed signs. The first one that happened back in November were in cardinal signs with Mars in Cancer and Pluto in Capricorn. A cardinal opposition like that is going to have a little more to do with fast changes and things really coming in and what kind of direction you're wanting to take or initiate. Whereas when we get into these fixed signs and this fixed sign configuration that we're dealing with this week, these are much more about long-term changes and long-term patterns. And being fixed signs, they can be very entrenched, they can be very stubborn, they can feel like these immovable objects or immovable patterns, and two things just really held up against each other in this tension. And so we might have felt a lack of power in our life. We might have felt like we've been up against some sort of titanic systemic power structure or power over us that we feel like we can't do anything about in some sort of way. Or we could have just been feeling very ambitious, really pushing ourselves, pushing forward in ways, and then also realizing how we're pushing for things that we may not fully authentically align with or aren't totally in our integrity, or in one way or another just realize are exhausting us or not really working out for the best. Whatever's been going on with this Mars Pluto tension and opposition, because we're also thinking about it being the nature of Saturn, we also want to think about holding that tension, and that oppositions can just take time. There is that idea of the tension of the opposites and having to hold that tension. And it can be used in a way sometimes where it just sounds like some kind of trope you just throw out that is some sort of cliched statement, but it really isn't. It really is a profound thing to hold that tension of the opposites and just remain within the tension and slowly, patiently notice what starts emerging and how it starts reshaping and this solution eventually emerging. And like the nature of Saturn, it can take time. But now that we're coming to the third and final one this week, hopefully you have been getting a deeper sense of your personal power, your ambition, your ability to assert yourself, your ability to get more clear about the essentials and what you really essentially want and desire. The Venus Saturn conjunction at the same time this week could also be helping with that, with Saturn sort of removing some of the excesses and honing down that Venus desire for what we truly want, as Mars and Pluto are also coming into this opposition. There's also the element that Mars has been retrograde during this opposition with Pluto, and we've also lived through this long retrograde opposition phase during this first part of this year. This is an image from the Gundestrup cauldron, the date of which is a little bit uncertain. It could go back a few centuries BC, it could be a little bit later, but in the image we see this divine smith who is dipping these warriors on the lower level of the image into, it seems like the smith is quenching them into this vat, and then they are merging as these more regal, noble, horse riding warriors with these incredible helmets of symbols riding on the top. There is a writer, Michael Enright, who I've read an essay analyzing this that brought up this idea of it being like this metamorphosis or transformation of these hot-blooded adolescent warrior figures being transformed into these more regal, noble figures who are be able to go out into society, sort of becoming more matured as more fully responsible adults, more responsibly in relationship with their power and desire and will. And it's an image that I really like in terms of the changes and the metamorphosis that we can go through with Mars retrograde periods, and how we can be reshaped and reforged and quenched through that process. And out of the Mars retrograde, we can come into more of a relationship with how do we want to responsibly use our power and will force in the community, in the greater society. And this is really up this week because of Mars coming into this opposition with Pluto, but also because of Mars coming into a square with the sun. And so that extreme heat of Mars being retrograde previously was most felt at the middle opposition of these three, the one that happened at the beginning of the year on January 2nd. And now that we're out of that retrograde process, it can be helpful to think about everything that you've gone through during this long Mars retrograde process, because it is going to be feeding into this final opposition with Pluto. The Mars retrograde began back on December 6th at 6 degrees of Leo. We then reached the midpoint on January 15th at about 26 degrees of Cancer. Mars then stationed direct on February 23rd, about 17 degrees of Cancer. Ever since February 23rd, Mars has been moving direct, but we still haven't quite made it back to that 6 degree mark where Mars stationed retrograde. And in particular, the fact that we had not made it back to the final Pluto opposition was perhaps even more important. And so there's something about this entire Mars retrograde process that we've been through that is leading into this moment this week, and something really being cultivated and shaped by this final opposition with Pluto. The other thing about this opposition between Mars and Pluto is that there is also a square happening with the Sun in Taurus at the same time, creating a fixed T square. We call configurations in astrology like this T squares because it kind of looks like a T, and they happen basically when there are two planets that are opposite one another, and then there is a third planet in the middle forming square aspects with both of them. In this case, like I already mentioned, it's important that it's happening in a fixed sign. You could have a cardinal sign T square. You could also have a mutable T square. And those are going to be a little different than having a fixed sign T square. And this is coming in exactly this week. So the Sun will form a square aspect with Mars on April 20th. A few days later, on April 23rd, the Sun will form a square aspect with Pluto, and that'll be just a few days before Mars and Pluto form their exact opposition on April 26th. Like I mentioned previously, with Mars and Pluto opposing each other in a fixed sign, the Sun also being involved in this T square really, to me, makes this a configuration and an issue and a pattern and a catalyst that's going to lead to very long-term changes. Fixed signs are about the long term, the long game. And because they are so good at creating long-term solutions, being really thorough and being able to bring things to a completion and sustain things over the long term as well, they can be signs that are also more resistant to change, more entrenched. In this case, though, they're in these fixed signs of being perhaps stubborn, perhaps less willing to change. Fixed signs can be a little bit more set in their ways. But Mars in a fire sign is that type of really disruptive catalyst that can really inflame things and trigger things and disrupt things. And so this could have some really deep-seated personal patterns and personal material, places you've been really over-identified, places you've just been habitually stuck or stagnant in, things really getting dredged up, being confronted about something. But it can create movement, it can create change, and hopefully you can come into a relationship with this in a way that it can lead to greater self-empowerment about whatever hardship, whatever test, whatever adversity you've been facing. The square aspect in astrology has to do with Mars. So again, when we go back to the Thema Mundi, we'll see that Mars in Aries forms a square to the moon in Cancer. Mars in Scorpio forms a square to the Sun in Leo. So again, Mars forms square aspects with both of the lights. As a result, the square aspect has the nature of Mars. And so that's why the square aspect is so catalytic. It can bring a lot of strife. It can bring a test of wills. It can bring conflict. It can bring disruption, but it creates change. it creates movement. It forces you to take action in response to things. And so that's going to be something to keep in mind this week. And you might want to do whatever kind of grounding, centering practices you can to avoid getting pulled into places that of great anger and so forth. And I do think being aware of anger and not getting into needless conflict and fights is going to be especially important, because although I was describing some positive ways to work with the Venus Saturn North Node combination, there is certainly a lot of potential suffering, dissatisfaction, and despair associated with that Venus Saturn combination of being upset about things not working out in the way that people want, where we combine that with this inflaming Mars Pluto combination. There can be a lot of anger, and there can certainly be either within yourself or people around you, people that are really going to be easily triggered and set off into conflict and anger. And so that's going to be something just to make sure you're keeping in mind. There's certainly going to maybe be things that are really important to actually go after and fight for and protect, but you really want to save your energy to really focus it in on the work that truly matters and protecting what truly matters for you, and not wasting it and not getting exhausted by just needless conflict that's not going to really make any difference one way or another. The other thing about the sun being involved with the square with Mars and Pluto is that it makes the solar cycle of Mars, as well as Pluto, but especially Mars, very important to keep in mind. And so while I mentioned we can go back to last November in 2024 due to that being the first time that Mars and Pluto formed an opposition, we can actually go back and even another year before to November of 2023, because November of 2023, in fact, November 18th of 2023, is when Mars and the Sun formed their last conjunction at about 25 degrees of Scorpio. It then moved into a critical phase of development last October in 2024 when Mars in Cancer formed a square with the Sun in Libra. Then after Mars went retrograde, as I mentioned before, we came into this opposition in January 15th in 26 degrees of Cancer. Now, this week on April 20th, we came into the Mars in Leo, forming a square with the Sun in Taurus. And so we've reached another critical phase of the Mars-Sun cycle. But this is not a waxing new, beginning of the cycle square. This is a last quarter square. This is a waning square. This is a Mars that is much more mature. This is a Mars that has been reshaped and reforged and tested through this Mars retrograde. And so this is a Mars-Sun combination that really does have some wisdom to it, and can look back at this cycle we've been in since 2023 and come into relationship with all the ways that your use of Mars and your relationship with Mars has changed since November 2023. And it's getting this really powerful testing right now and reshaping by Pluto. It just makes it so much more intense in some ways, and it might make the tests and adversity you're facing feel all the more overwhelming and intense. But it also means there are incredible lessons about yourself and your own self-empowerment to pull out of this process, whatever process you're in right now. And so again, if you go back to November 18th of 2023, that was when we had this conjunction of the Sun and Mars in Scorpio, about 25 degrees. Then in October of 2024, we came into the waxing square of the Sun and Mars. So this was more like this new sense of Mars coming in here, which also was around the same time that Mars was starting to get closer to the opposition with Pluto. That actually happened more like at the end of October and the beginning of November. We then went through the retrograde, and in the middle of January 15th, we get the opposition of Mars in Cancer with the Sun in Capricorn. And then since that time, Mars has gone direct And we're coming now into this final waning square between the Sun and Mars on April 20th, as at the same time, Mars and Pluto are coming into the opposition this week. So the other thing that's really interesting is the Sun is also forming a square with Pluto, and that's happening on April 23rd. But this is not a waning square like the square between the Sun and Mars. This is a waxing square, a first quarter square between the Sun and Pluto. So, in contrast to this Mars Sun cycle being at this very critical turning point that's much more mature and much more about reorienting where we've gone with this long process since 2023. This is a new process, a new phase of change, new sense of this deep unconscious plutonic power. So that the Sun Pluto, it's really kind of putting us in touch with this deeper sense of unconscious power. And it also is putting us in touch with ways in which maybe these greater overwhelming plutonic power sources feel, overwhelming. And yet Mars is really bringing in this courage to resist and be courageous and push through, and fight for what's important to us. And so it's a very deep configuration that's very much about personal power, your personal purpose, what you really want to forge and create and protect in this time of incredible collective change, which we're only getting to the start of. There's going to be so much more coming in next year and the years ahead, but especially this next year. And so this Sun-Pluto square that we have going on right now goes back to January, around the same time that Venus and Saturn were together, and Venus was coming into relationship with Uranus. So it's really interesting. A lot of this is all going back to this late January time period. And that was when we had the Sun-Pluto conjunction in Pluto in Aquarius, in the second degree of Aquarius. And so you might want to think back to then and some sort of sense of Pluto relating to your solar purpose that you're coming into relationship with. Now, this was set for Washington, D.C. Pretty amazing that Sun-Pluto was rising on the ascendant at the moment of the conjunction. And you also probably know, if you've been following astrology, and you can see this date, that January 21st is obviously the day after Donald Trump was inaugurated. And you also probably already realized when I brought up that November 3rd date that basically this whole Mars-Pluto thing got started at the same time that Donald Trump was elected president, which means the Trump presidency is also reaching this very critical turning point this week. And it will be really interesting to see what happens in the news. And indeed, if we look at the date that Donald Trump was inaugurated, we see the Sun-Pluto up near the midheaven with Venus and Saturn together, Venus just barely separating from Saturn, heading towards that first sextile with Uranus. So we can obviously see there's something really big that's going to also be coming up related to the Trump administration, all of the immense power grabbing and accumulation of power that they've been trying to amass and kind of push through. In this chart, we also see the Mars retrograde down on the IC, and I think we're also going to be seeing a lot of the resistance continuing to build against some of the more authoritarian power grabs and power amassing that the administration's been building. So we'll see what happens this week, but there's going to obviously be some really big events happening around the Trump administration. And so we finally come into that opposition on Saturday between Mars and Pluto. And at this point, the sun has moved beyond the Mars-Pluto opposition, but you can see the moon is waning. And so just as we start pulling away from this Mars-Pluto opposition, but it's still very much in effect, the moon is going to wane at the very end of Aries, go into Taurus, and that waning moon is going to re-trigger it just as we come into this new moon on Taurus on Sunday, April 27th. So whatever issues we are gaining and realizing and going through this week are going to be part of what leads us into this very potent Taurus new moon. I do love this Taurus new moon for restoration, for restoration, retelling your story, coming into a new relationship with your story. And I like the astrology of May. It's not as chaotic and difficult and challenging as the astrology of April and March. And I'm hoping it'll be helpful for everyone getting a better sense of stability and productive growth out of all these big changes we've been going through. What is notable about this Taurus new moon, as I've been talking about these aspects this week, is that Mars is starting to separate from the opposition with Pluto. Venus is the lord of the new moon. She's still exalted in Pisces, and she's moving away from Saturn. Now, in both cases, are only like a degree or less than a degree moving away, but they are moving away. And so this new moon in Taurus is finally pulling us out of this Venus Saturn North Node, Mars Pluto dynamic that we've been in for many, many months, as I've been talking about. And so, whatever happens this week, it's a good time just to be paying attention. And I hope you can use whatever goes on to help you deepen into your purpose about whatever it is that you've been building and creating with your life. If you would like to talk about the astrology that's been going on, my books are open right now, and I'd love to work with you on an astrology consultation. I will put a link below to how you can book a session with me on my scheduler. I'll also put a link below to my Patreon community. I share extra material there. Each week, I usually share a video that I don't put on YouTube that breaks down the movement of the moon each day during the week. There also will be discounts on consultations and other things like that, and other extra material that I share there. Plus, there are two higher tiers, each of which has a class and a meeting every month that you can be part of. And I'll put a link below so you can read more about that. It would also be great if you would like and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. That really does help out my channel here on YouTube. Otherwise, I wish you the best this week. There's a lot going on, a lot changing, but we are starting to come out of this chaotic recent period of time of just great change. And while things in astrology will be continuing to change, I hope you can come into relationship with the way that all of this is helping you hone in on what's most important to you, what you want to focus on, and that you find some greater fulfillment and self-realization coming out of all of these cycles playing out this week. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.